That fulfills all of Koch's postulates. So the question then, which is the part that I've really had to struggle with, and only I would say in the last month have I been really convinced of this through my own research and listening and watching to so many people who've spent decades looking into this, is, has that actual study ever been done? Now, most people would say it actually has, and the person who did that was named Louis Pasteur. He was the French scientist of the time in the late 1800s. He was the originator of the germ theory, essentially. Not that it really started with him, but he essentially popularized it. And he spent decades of his life doing exactly this: isolating bacteria from sick people, purifying it supposedly, giving it to normal people, and proving that germs were the source of disease. Germs in this case meaning bacteria, but the same thing applies with viruses. And he published it. He was feted by the prime ministers of Europe. He had finally proven this. The trouble is, Pasteur actually was known as a fraudster and kind of a charlatan by many people. And one of the ways we know that is because he actually, believe it or not, kept a personal diary where, on the one hand, he would publish data showing this effect of contagion, of introducing or giving animals pure germs and causing them to be sick. And meanwhile, he was writing a personal diary in which he claimed that not once in his entire career was he ever able to make an animal sick by giving them purified, isolated bacteria. Not once. He instructed his family members to never publish this diary, which apparently one of his sons or son-in-laws or stepsons or somebody who I guess didn't like him very much, he actually did publish it. And you can see how Pasteur essentially fraudulently claimed these results when nothing of the sort ever happened. One of the ways we know this is that we now know that on his deathbed, Pasteur apparently said, "The germ is nothing, the terrain is everything." And by terrain, he means, is the cow poisoned? And essentially, those studies, purifying viruses or bacteria and making other animals sick in the same way that they would normally get sick, like aerosolized viruses or drinking purified bacteria to cause diarrhea. As far as I know, and as far as the other people who've looked into this, this has never been done. In other words, the only criteria that we would accept with the ping pong ball: throw the darn ping pong ball at the wall and see what happens. Isolate the bacteria or virus, give it to a normal person and see what happens. We know what happens, which is basically nothing. Now, as a result of this, the people who were convinced that infectious disease was real and that bacteria and then later viruses did actually cause disease, they came to essentially a fork in the road where they couldn't prove Koch's postulates, which is basically the laws of logic. Another way I describe this is like if you wake up, before you go to bed, you park your car in the street like we do in San Francisco, and then you wake up in the morning and you want to know whether your car is still there. So anybody would say the way to do that is to go outside and look and see if your car is there. But that's Koch's postulates. And Koch's postulates were never proven for viruses or bacteria, as far as we can see. So they decided either they could abandon the theory and look for a whole different model for how and why people get sick, or they could change Koch's postulates. In other words, we no longer have to go outside and look to see if the car is there. We could say to ourselves, well, nobody would bother to steal our car, so it must be there. So that's essentially what happened. And then they became Rivers postulates, which Andy in his webinar went through. And then later they became what are called Hill's postulates or Hill's rules. So this I found on Wikipedia as the new way that we decide whether or not a virus is the cause of a disease or a bacteria. Because again, they couldn't prove Koch's postulates, which is basically simple logic. So the solution was to change the postulates. And there's about 10 or 11 of these postulates, which I won't read them all, but I am going to read 3. And I just want to point out, these were apparently made in around 1965, middle 60s. And these are still to this day accepted widely by the public health community and by epidemiologists for how we prove viral causation. So let me just read 3 of them. Number 3, causation is likely if there is a very specific population at a specific site with no other likely explanation. In other words, you can now say that a virus caused this disease if a bunch of people get sick and you can't think of another reason why they got sick. Postulate number 5 says, quote, greater exposure should generally lead to a greater incidence of the effect. That sounds reasonable. However, in some cases, the mere presence of the factor can trigger the effect. In other cases, an inverse proportion is observed. In other words, greater exposure leads to a lower incidence. So if you translate that, what it means is if you have a greater exposure to this virus, you will have a greater incidence of the disease. Or it may not have any effect on the disease. Or it may lead to a lower effect of the disease or a lower incidence of the disease. I would only say that that covers all your bases. In other words, more exposure could get worse, could be the same, or could get better. And then number 8 is, quote, occasionally it is possible to appeal to experimental evidence, which means, I guess, occasionally it's not possible to appeal to experimental evidence. And so you just have to guess, or you just have to believe that that's what's happened. Now, I'm all for believing in things, right? And I don't want everybody to send me Bruce Lipton's book on the biology of belief. I like believing in things. I think it makes a big difference, as I'll say in a minute, what we think. But I don't want people to prove that a virus is the cause of disease because they believe it or not.